In this episode, we're talking about the state of the industry through a petite French lens. This and more on Indie Game Arcade. Welcome to Indie Game Arcade, a podcast that deep dives into the latest and greatest indie games. My name is Chris. I am your resident indie game playing dad, and I was going to do a deep dive today into Clair Obscur Expedition 33. However, the more I was talking with Joseph about it, who I swear to God will probably be back next week, I just didn't want to say for sure because we keep having hiccups on that part as far as his moving and everything. But he's working on it. I think he's gonna want to talk about it as well. But that was one of the games I had been playing a lot this past week because who hasn't been playing it? And despite how it looks, this is an indie game, surprisingly. But because I think that we're going to want to talk about it for another episode, I wanted to kind of shift things a little bit and do something a little bit different for this episode. I'm going to briefly just give you a little bit of an overview of what this game is, and then kind of look at the state of the industry, the gaming industry, and indie games as they relate to the larger AAA discussion, kind of through the lens of what Clair Obscur has done or created. So for those of you that don't know by chance, so Clair Obscur Expedition 33 was developed by Sandfall Interactive. This is a indie development studio from France, made up of about 30-ish people, and a little less than half of those are former developers from Ubisoft that I think just got sort of sick of the AAA scene and lack of creativity there. Retails for $49.99. And just for an idea of what type of game this is a turn-based combat RPG, but very much in the vein of Final Fantasy. And I'm talking about the later installments of Final Fantasy. So very, very cinematic and very refined and defined and just gorgeous to look at. Let me tell you something. This is one of the most cinematic gaming experiences I think I've ever had in my life. With that, there is a whole lot of cutscenes. And sometimes in a game, you can have too many cutscenes. I might save a little bit of that discussion for the next time that we talk about it, but there is a lot in this game. But the game just gives you a lot in general. So it also is a very dark story as well. It's very grim, very dark. So I would say Final Fantasy with a little bit of flavor of Dark Souls as far as overtone and I would say creature and monster design. With that said, it is making, if you pay attention to the industry at all, if you are on Steam at all, you have seen this thing advertised, you've seen it pop up, you've seen people talking about this. And the reason why is because this game is just outperforming everything, blowing expectations completely away, especially for a team of 30-something people. I want to put an asterisk next to that because they did outsource a few things to help with that. And I think, if I remember correctly, probably adding about 40 other people via outsourcing. So this is where I want to put a slight bit of asterisk, even in general, next to the idea of talking about this in the vein of being an indie game. And this is where a lot of things get kind of blurry when we're talking about indie games as a whole, and where things like looking at other games like Dave the Diver, or especially I'm going to talk about a little bit in this episode, Baldur's Gate 3, where they were created by what were independent studios. And these are studios that are not beholden to some larger company or something, and are basically able to create the game that they want without oversight and without this other company kind of breathing down their necks or something. You know, they're getting to make the game that they want to make. Now, in the case of Baldur's Gate 3, they were partnered with Wizards of the Coast, obviously, who own the Dungeons & Dragons IP. However, they were given total creative freedom to create this thing. So in that sense, it was still indie in a way with, you know, some influence and a lot more backing as well. Like they received extra money and everything. So that's where like sometimes you get a little bit of blurred lines and stuff. Some similar things happened with Dave the Diver. In that case, it was a smaller subsection, like a smaller independent company that was like an offshoot or housed within a larger company, but they were able to be autonomous and create what they wanted without the influence of their like larger parent. But it's like in those cases, it's like, all right, then are they actually an indie studio? Are they an indie game or are they not? Because they do kind of still have support from this other thing. So in both the ideas of Baldur's Gate 3 and Dave the Diver, you know, there's that like really blurry line, that question. But that isn't really the case here for Clair Obscur. The interesting part for Clair Obscur Expedition 33, though, is when we're having those conversations about indie games, a lot of times when you think of an indie game, you think of something, especially because of how popular they are, you think of stuff like Undertale or Celeste, where it's really one developer that you're thinking of. And this was a team of 30-something people who also outsourced some of that work to others to help. So maybe combined a team of 70 people. And there hasn't really been delineation with that as far like in the indie game, you know, industry. Like we don't talk about, you know, AAA indie games. At least like that's not a common nomenclature when we're discussing things. And if we were going to say something is a AAA indie game, I would say Baldur's Gate 3, that's where that is. You had a team of hundreds of people working on that game. If you don't really know the story there, that was like Larian Studios, which through, as they started with like Divinity and through like Divinity Original Sin 2, they were a smaller studio. And then it was kind of like talking with Wizards of the Coast, and they're like, hey, we're going to be working on Baldur's Gate 3, we do need funding and we're going to make this game and stuff. And Wizards is like, here's stuff to help you get started. Also, you own this thing, like you are in control. So they still get that autonomy, but they're able to expand to a team of like 400 something people. So it became huge, but they were still independent. And that's where like it gets difficult sometimes, really just trying to delineate what is indie and what is not. So if we're coming from the standpoint of considering, just hypothetically at least, considering Baldur's Gate 3 as a AAA indie game or like triple I, as I've seen some people kind of say, then maybe we would call Clair Obscur like a double I, just because of team size specifically. I don't know. You guys tell me what you think about that. But the main point of this episode I wanted to get to is kind of like what those two games have done to the gaming industry. And I don't mean that like that almost sounds like a negative. Well, I guess for some it's a negative, but for most, for us as players, definitely a positive. On paper, Clair Obscur should not be able to perform the way it does and should not be as successful as it is, yet it is dominating the market. So for example, like in the first day, this thing sold like 500,000 copies, right? And like within 3, that number was up to like 1 million, which is insane to think about. This doesn't have some sort of huge publisher attached to it or anything. So why is this doing so well? Well, it's because it's a good game. It stands on merit alone. That's why it's good. But also think about like some of the AAA games that we've gotten and the state of the gaming industry. And I don't want to shit talk too much, but I want to bring up a few examples of things and just kind of talk about like where we are kind of at with different things. Seeing the success of Expedition 33 here just reminded me of when Baldur's Gate 3 came out and the reaction to that, where all of these developers of different studios and stuff were saying like, hey, you guys need to understand this is a flash in the pan. This is just a moment. Someone said like, this is a unicorn. This is not going to be a standard. This would set the bar too high. Gamers should not expect to see more games like this. So don't get used to it. And like the kind of like fear that it instilled in those studios and like the industry a little bit as a whole for, I would say, bigger studios, because you know what? Small devs and developers and stuff like that, they're not worried about that, because here's the thing, guys. AAA studios are about one thing. They have to make money. And I'm not saying that as like them being some sort of soulless, just corporate thing. That can definitely happen with some studios, see Blizzard, Activision. However, some studios are just so massive, they have to make so much money or else like they won't function anymore. But there is also a thing called corporate greed, and it just becomes sort of the main goal. When we get down to the indie side of things, that is where you are seeing more creativity and storytelling and cultural influence and impact is almost, and I'm not going to say always, but almost always at the forefront, much over making profits, which is why you find a lot more innovation in indie games. Think about like the absolute just mind-boggling game that is Blueprints. No AAA studio would ever have touched that idea. There's no possible way. To them, that would be like, that's a gamble. There's no way for us to like monetize this. It's just not going to sell. But if you're like on YouTube or anything or TikTok or anything, like you're constantly seeing people talk about Blueprints because it's engaging, it's interesting, it's new, it's innovative. And to be honest, the people that tend to like send hateful comments on those videos, if you go and check their profiles, you're likely to see more like Call of Duty gameplay vids and stuff on their profiles than anything, at least like in my experience. And I'm not here to trash Call of Duty players or anything like that. Like, you know, there is a game style and a game for everybody. Like if that's your thing, hey, that's your thing. However, like I feel bad for folks where the innovation just isn't there for you anymore. Games like Call of Duty and I think sports games are probably the most notorious for this, of really each game is just a slight update from the last one, and there's really nothing new brought to the table. You know what you're gonna get as soon as you start playing. Those games are not leading in any kind of innovation. And those games also tend to be the most predatory as far as doing things like passes, where you can like earn so many things, but then you have to pay to get the full like season pass to get certain skins or whatever else, and microtransactions, or these are live service games and you have to purchase like the new content every time that comes out, but only until they have the next game ready. And then you have to do all those things like all over again for that next game. The idea of those things, microtransactions, live service models, just sounds just god awful to me. Maybe you don't have a problem with that. Like I'm not gonna lie, I used to play Overwatch all the time, and it had stuff just like that. It had like the seasons and stuff where you could get different things and do those microtransactions. And like, let me tell you, I was so deep into Overwatch, I had a dedicated podcast just to Overwatch. And I stopped doing it because of, one, just how awful a company Blizzard Activision became. I guess they actually always were that awful. We just didn't know it yet. And two, how predatory it became, and then how bad the game became, because they honestly just kept putting profits over the game itself and over their employees. Let me tell you guys something. I found this statistic on this site, Statista, about this survey in 2023. 67% of AAA game studios use daily rewards and missions as retention tactics, repeating the same things over and over again each day. 67%. That's nuts. That's nuts. So that's more AAA games than not. Now listen to this. According to a GDC report, indie games have approximately 4.5 times greater retention rate than AAA games. So you think about that. These AAA studios are doing all of these kind of like cheap tactics that don't involve moving a story along, providing any new experiences. It's microtransactions to make money. It is repetitive tasks to keep you coming back to the game. Yet indie games that typically don't implement any of those things have more retention. When Baldur's Gate 3 launched, it had no battle passes, no microtransactions, no live service. It had over 100 hours of content, which is more than most games regardless of status. Hundreds of possible character interactions, real true RPG choices. Like you had full control over the type of character you could play and what you could do. It was diverse. It was totally inclusive. If someone wants to say woke, first of all, if you use the term woke, you and I are probably not going to get along very well. But if you call a game woke, that's probably a game I'm absolutely going to love. And that is this type of game. I love games that are unapologetically diverse and inclusive. And it did it so well. It was polished, there were minimal bugs, and it had really deep replayability. And it was made for way less money than a lot of AAA games. So it's like no wonder all of these big studios were freaked out when this game launched. So then they say, no, this will never happen again. You know, it can't happen again. Especially when you consider games like Redfall and like what happened with that game. Or, even Cyberpunk 2077 and how much of a failure that game was on launch. Those games, the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One versions of that game were like nearly unplayable when it launched. The frame rates were like dropping below like 20 FPS. Textures were popping in late or not even like loading. There were tons of game-breaking bugs. It was crashing. And like, it didn't even start there with just performance. Like the marketing around this thing was just like purposefully misleading because the developers were fully aware that this game was not ready for launch. But like they pushed it forward anyway because they're like, hey, we set this date. We gotta make that money, guys. We'll fix it in post. That is literally the mentality of the majority of AAA studios, aside from maybe Nintendo. However, they're not without their flaws as well, obviously. But that game was so broken that like Sony even delisted that game from their store, their PlayStation store. The developer had to start offering refunds. It was such a mess. And it's not like that, like I would love to say that that is a unicorn, that would never happen again. But we know that this happens all the time. There's been like multiple Assassin's Creed games that have had things like this happen, where like they launch and immediately out the gate, there's problems, there's bugs. I know I'm picking a lot on Blizzard Activision here, but can you ever remember a time a Diablo game launched or a World of Warcraft expansion launched and was playable day one? Like, I've never experienced getting one of their games and being able to play it for at least, a day or two. So the idea that these studio heads say something like, oh, this game that is very well done and very well polished should not be the bar is crazy to me. That's insane. And it kind of shows the success of Baldur's Gate 3 really shows that players were tired of feeling disrespected. Otherwise, this game would not have performed as well as it did. So they say, again, it's a unicorn moment. It's a flash in the pan. You can't expect games like this. And then Clair Obscur Expedition 33 comes out and shows that an indie studio can do it. The idea of raising the bar, raising standards, us as players expecting that we can have good, polished, cinematic, fun to play experiences within our gaming should not be such a wild concept. It's not a unicorn. At least it doesn't have to be. Sort of on the playing devil's advocate a little bit. I do feel for smaller developers that are, smaller studios than Sandfall. However, we as players are not stupid. We understand, especially those of us that play indie games, are probably more in tune with what it takes to create a game than players that are strictly just AAA players and everything. So, we're not going to expect a Baldur's Gate 3 or a Clair Obscur Expedition 33 from a solo dev or a team of even 10. There's no way. So the idea of, managing those expectations and stuff, I don't think is really a problem. So there shouldn't be any warnings about setting our hopes too high or setting the bar too high. The bar is that we expect to play a game that will entertain us, that will respect us, and that will be goddamn playable when we purchase it. That's not hard to do. But in an era where AAA studios are giving us Gollum and that awful King Kong game that came out, I understand how some of those big studios are like, oh, I just don't get it. We slapped a game together and we put this little frog guy in there that likes rings. I don't understand what they want. Obviously, we have people in it for the wrong reasons. And that, my friends, is why I truly believe indie games are where it's at. That is where you're going to get the most bang for your buck. That's where you're going to get the better stories, the better innovation, and more respect. Swin Vinke from Larian Studios said at one point that standards change so rapidly that there are no standards. And I love that. I think that's a great thing to keep in mind when we're thinking about these indie games and especially comparing them in these kinds of ways. Let the indie game scene show us what it can do without holding them to task, because the indie developers will respect us. They're not out for our money. They're out to share their visions with us. So make sure that you keep supporting indie game devs and small studios. Power up! If you're enjoying this episode so far, do me a favor, throw me a like, a follow, share this episode or the podcast with folks who love indie games so we can get more of these game recommendations out there and support indie game devs like I've been talking about in this episode. We've also got a YouTube channel at youtube.com/nerdsloth where you can catch us playing more indie games or check out our top 5 and top 10 series for even more indie game recommendations, because we believe there is an indie game out there for everyone. Combo! Hey, I'm actually gonna talk about a game. I promise. Let's talk about a game I have been playing this week in FREERIDE. This came out on May 1st. It feels a bit undefined as far as a premise, but I mean that in the best way. It's still really fun. It's a cute little adventure, but it also, interestingly enough, serves as a personality test that I absolutely love that about it. I always talk about how I'm also really into psychology and stuff, and I'm definitely a sucker for taking personality tests. Part of my job, outside of this, I have to work in that world sometimes, not too often, but sometimes I do have a little bit of crossover, and I've had to do a lot of personality tests specifically for that stuff like MBTI and HBDI and DISC assessment and all of those kinds of things. So like I get really interested when there's something that like analyzes me as a person. So this is kind of fun. So basically you were playing as this kid and you meet this spirit named Lapida, who is a spirit conductor. And she, when you meet her, she thinks you're somebody else. At least that's what she says. But she convinces you to get on a train called a fate train to journey into the spirit world, which is just this crazy world. And getting on the train too it's full of characters of all shapes and sizes. A lot of them are just like anthropomorphic kind of folks, different animals, and some of them aren't even animals at all. A lot of the game, I would say the majority of it is talking to and reacting and conversing with all of these characters and kind of helping them through or not helping them. I mean, it's really up to you. You have quite a bit of freedom, different emotional things or other kind of tasks and stories and stuff. But it's not all confined to this train. Like it will make different stops. Or you can get out, you can explore. One of the first things you get to do is like go to this like tower that has like all kinds of stuff that you can sort of do. So there is like some light platforming. There's quite a bit of environmental puzzle solving as well. It is constantly, and you don't know this until the very end. And I think I remember talking about this a little bit last week where I was like, the game touts itself as analyzing all of your conscious and unconscious choices. And I wasn't understanding or sure like how it's analyzing those. But what it's really doing is this game is keeping track of every single thing you do. And it's not just like the dialogue choices that you make, but also like how long you spend doing certain things, wandering around the area or puzzles or like neglecting going into certain things or neglecting talking to certain people. So it's like when it talks about your unconscious stuff, like that literally is part of it. How much you spend wandering around was like a big thing for mine. Once you like get so far, like it will basically assign you like one of, I think it was like 30 personality types. Maybe it was like 32. I don't remember. 30 something personality types. Like some of them are bully or detective or clown. I got assigned leader on my playthrough, which kind of surprised me a little bit, but I have seen that pop up like as an attribute in some of the other things I've had to do before. But like, I was kind of surprised in that I don't see leader or leadership as like my prevailing sort of, I don't know, outward attribute, personality type. However, my in-game interactions or in game actions, I guess, may very well differ from decisions that I make in the real world, right? So I think that that's kind of interesting in a way. I would love to see more of a breakdown of like the things that you get scored on and stuff and kind of compare that to an outside personality test to kind of see where my game sense and my game decisions are different from decisions I make in my personal life. That's a really cool thought and just weird avenue that my brain started going down after getting that feedback. But anyway, just overall, I didn't feel like I had a ton of buy-in right away in that I felt like I had anything that really invested me in the story, like right off the bat. However, I do really enjoy the whimsical nature of this game, especially in a very Studio Ghibli sort of way, in that you're sort of whisked off to this really strange world full of spirits that are just could be like any sort of thing and all have like very different personalities, some of which are very fun, some of which are not as fun, but there's always something unique or interesting to learn about them. And there's different tactics and approaches and stuff to everything. And it's, you know, not unlike real life in that way. But it does have a lot going for it. And it's a unique game. It's bright and colorful. I'd be interested in playing it again just to try some different things and see what this game has to say about me rather than what I have to say about the game, which in itself is an absurdly interesting thing to be able to like do. a game that's analyzing me as I play it rather than me just like reviewing and analyzing the game. That's an insane thing to talk about. But here we are in 2025 talking about an indie game that is analyzing my personality.
Final round!
Let me tell you about some of the games that are upcoming that I am excited about. Nine Kings releases on May 19th. This is a roguelike kingdom and deck builder. It is a little bit of both. Reminds me a lot of this game that I talked about quite a while back, Just a Shadow game, in that it is, I would say first, I mean, it combines both mechanics, but it is a roguelike deck builder, and you are using your cards to build your kingdom, and then you are going to battle against another kingdom. Whereas like in the Just a Shadow game, it was like a little bit of that too, the tower defense kind of aspect, but using like the cards to create minions and doing sacrifices and stuff. But like similar premise. It looks really cool. I'm very interested in this. I'm gonna try to play it maybe for next week. We'll see. Fretless, The Wrath of Rifson. That just sounds cool. Fretless, The Wrath of Rifson. Comes out May 22nd. This is a turn-based RPG that uses music and timed mechanics. Just looks silly. It looks really fun. I love the idea of like a character that is like a musician thrown into an RPG-themed game and like using music in that way. I was a musician for a really long time. And so like whenever music is inserted as like a focal point in something, that is something that will have some appeal to me because of my past and just because I'm a huge fan of music. I love music. So yeah, I'm very, very interested to see what this game is going to be like. From the initial trailer and screenshots, I think it looks really fun. It looks like it's going to be kind of like a goofy, funny sort of overtones, and just it looks like it'll be something up my alley. And finally, Monster Train 2 on May 21st. I've talked about this game extensively multiple times. I'm so excited for it. It looks like it'll be very similar to the original game with a whole lot of new things added to it, but like that core gameplay mechanic is still there, and I love that. This time you're going to heaven instead of hell. Tons more clans, more cards, totally different like graphic overhaul it looks too. Like, I mean, the art and design the same, but as far as like the graphics look a lot more 3D in this one. Like it's not a three-dimensional game, but I would say three-dimensional presenting, if that makes sense. Like it looks like things would be able to move around if it were a 3D game versus the other one was a lot more just looked straight up 2D and kind of like that Slay the Spire kind of design. So there's that. I'm very excited for all of these games, but Monster Train 2 is, man, I am so ready for that one. I never uninstalled Monster Train from my Steam Deck. It will be on there forever, unless Monster Train 2 is even better. And then maybe I'll just be playing that one. Who knows? But anyway, I'll probably be talking about that in the near future. So prepare yourselves.
Game over.
If you had a good time listening to this episode, stick around for the bumper. Learn how you can support the show and all the things we do here at Sloth Creative. You can check out the show notes for our link tree. That'll take you to our social media, our Discord, our subreddit, merch store, tons of other cool stuff. Get in touch with us because I want to know what indie games you're playing so you can help us elevate these games and we can help support indie developers together. But that is game over for me. My name's Chris, and I'll continue on the next episode.
Continue.
Indie Game Arcade is recorded and produced by Sloth Creative. If you're looking for more gaming content, head over to youtube.com/nerdsloth for indie game let's plays and recommendations. If you'd like to support the show, head over to patreon.com/nerdsloth, where you can select a pledge and receive access to hundreds of hours of bonus content from everything at Sloth Creative. If you're an indie game developer and would like us to review your game or explore other opportunities, send an email to nerdslothcreative@gmail.com with the subject line Indie Game Arcade. Thanks for listening, and keep supporting indie game devs.